They said the estate never answered. In my 37 years working for wealthy families across 3 continents, I had learned to accept their peculiar beliefs without question. The Carmichael estate, perched on 43 acres overlooking the Hudson Valley, was no exception to the eccentric traditions that seem to accompany vast inherited wealth. When Victoria Carmichael hired me as her estate manager in October of 2021, she mentioned only one unusual instruction during our interview in the mahogany-panelled library. "The house doesn't respond to noise after midnight," she said, her pale fingers tracing the rim of her crystal tumbler. "It's been that way since my grandfather's time." "We've learned to respect the silence." I nodded, adding this to my mental catalogue of wealthy family quirks alongside the Duke of Wessex's insistence that his staff wear white gloves on Sundays, or the oil heiress in Dubai who required all clocks to be wound counterclockwise. These were the harmless eccentricities of old money, I told myself. Traditions that provided comfort to families whose fortunes had been built on foundations they preferred not to examine too closely. The estate itself was magnificent in its understated elegance. Built in 1894 by Victoria's great-grandfather, railroad magnate Edmund Carmichael, it contained 47 rooms connected by corridors that seemed to stretch longer than the blueprints suggested. Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes covered floors of imported Italian marble, while oil paintings by masters, whose names I recognised from museum placards watched from gilded frames. For 6 months, I maintained the estate without incident, until the night when it began to answer back. The first time I heard it, I dismissed it as the settling of old wood. The estate was over 130 years old, after all. Ancient houses develop their own rhythms, their own breathing patterns. Every estate manager learns to distinguish between the benign creaks of age and the sounds that require investigation. But this was different. This was deliberate. I had been conducting my nightly security rounds, a routine I performed every evening at 11:15 sharp. Victoria insisted on these walks through the empty corridors, checking locks and ensuring the estate's 17 fireplaces were properly extinguished. The family had retired to their respective wings, Victoria to her suite overlooking the rose garden, her son Marcus to the converted library on the 2nd floor, and her daughter Elena to the tower rooms she had claimed as her private sanctuary. That night in April of 2022, I was passing through the main gallery when my footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Nothing unusual in that. But then, 3 seconds later, I heard an identical echo. Same rhythm, same weight, same duration. As if someone was walking exactly parallel to my path, matching my pace step for step. I stopped. The echo stopped. I waited 30 seconds, counting each breath in the darkness. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed once for the half hour. When I resumed walking, the matching footsteps resumed immediately, maintaining perfect synchronization with my own movements. Not following matching. As if the house itself was learning to walk alongside me. I spent the following 3 days researching the phenomenon. My methodical nature had served me well in previous positions, where paranoid billionaires often imagined threats that existed only in their guilt-ridden minds. I documented everything, temperature readings, electromagnetic measurements, even consulted with an acoustics expert from Columbia University who specialized in architectural sound phenomena, Dr. Harrison's report arrived via encrypted email 48 hours later. The Carmichael Estate's architecture should not produce delayed echo effects, he wrote. The marble floors, high ceilings and corridor dimensions would create immediate sound reflection, not the 3-second delay you've described. Furthermore, the matching rhythm suggests an active response rather than passive acoustic reflection. I filed his report alongside my nightly logs. noting that the footsteps had occurred every evening since that first incident, always during my security rounds, always matching my exact pace, always stopping when I stopped, resuming when I resumed. The family remained unaware. Victoria continued her daily routine of correspondence and garden supervision. Marcus spent his days in the estate's wine cellar, cataloguing bottles that predated the stock market crash of 1929. Elena rarely emerged from her tower sanctuary, though I occasionally glimpsed her silhouette in the windows during my afternoon rounds of the grounds. None of them walked the corridors after midnight. That had been my domain alone, until something decided to join me. On the seventh night, I chose a different route. Instead of following my usual path through the main gallery, I took the servants' staircase to the second floor. The footsteps followed, adjusting their echo to match the wooden steps rather than marble. The Carmichael family's relationship with silence had deep roots. During my first month on the estate, I had spent considerable time reviewing the property's historical records, a task that Victoria had specifically requested as part of my orientation. The leather-bound journals, dating back to the estate's construction, revealed a pattern of carefully maintained quiet that transcended mere preference. Edmund Carmichael, the original patriarch, had built the estate as a refuge from the noise of industrial progress. His railroad empire had made him one of America's wealthiest men, but the constant clatter of trains and the shouting of workers had, according to his private journals, begun to affect his sanity. "The world has become too loud," he wrote in 1893. "I shall build a place where silence reigns supreme, where a man might hear his own thoughts without interference." The estate's design reflected this obsession. Walls were constructed with double thickness. Corridors were designed with sound-absorbing materials. Even the servants were instructed to wear soft-soled shoes and speak only when absolutely necessary. Edmund's son, Victoria's grandfather, had continued these traditions, adding his own restrictions. No music after sundown, no conversations in the main halls, no gathering in groups larger than 3. Each generation had added their own layers to this cult of quiet. Victoria's father had installed specially designed windows that blocked external noise. Victoria herself had eliminated the estate's telephone system, communicating with the outside world exclusively through written correspondence and a single secure line in her private study. The silence, they believed, protected them from something. I was beginning to understand what that something might be. The estate's financial records told a different story than the one displayed in the main halls. While the public rooms showcased generations of tasteful wealth accumulation, the private ledgers revealed a more complex narrative. I discovered these documents quite by accident while organising Victoria's study, tucked away in a hidden compartment behind false-backed filing cabinets. Edmund Carmichael's railroad fortune had not been built through conventional business practices. The records detailed land acquisitions made through questionable methods, entire communities displaced without adequate compensation, Native American territories claimed through forged documents, and competitor lines sabotaged through methods that resulted in what the newspapers had diplomatically termed tragic accidents. The pattern continued through subsequent generations. Victoria's grandfather had expanded into steel manufacturing during both World Wars, selling defective materials that his own quality inspectors had flagged as dangerous. Her father had built his pharmaceutical empire by suppressing research that showed harmful side effects in several widely prescribed medications. Each generation of Carmichaels had accumulated their wealth by ignoring the voices of those their business practices harmed. The silence they cultivated within the estate walls seemed to mirror the silence they had imposed upon their victims' communities destroyed, workers injured, patients who died from medications they knew were flawed. Victoria herself continued this tradition in her role as board chair of several corporations. The environmental impact studies she had buried, the worker safety reports that never reached regulatory agencies, the clinical trials that conveniently lost their data when results proved unfavourable. The footsteps that matched my nightly rounds were beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like consequence, as if all those silenced voices had finally found a way to make themselves heard. Marcus Carmichael had never shown interest in the family's business empire. At 34, he spent his days in the wine cellar, surrounded by bottles that represented decades of careful collecting. His knowledge of vintages was encyclopedic, his palate refined to an almost supernatural degree. But his passion for wine seemed driven by something deeper than mere appreciation. During our conversations, which occurred primarily during my afternoon inventory checks, Marcus would speak of the stories each bottle contained. "This 1947 Chateau d'Yquem," he would, holding a dusty bottle toward the cellar's amber lighting, "was bottled during the year my great-grandfather's steel foundry collapsed, killing 18 workers. Their families never received compensation, initially." I assumed these comments were coincidental, the random musings of a man who spent too much time alone in the basement of a mansion filled with generational guilt. But as weeks passed, I realised Marcus was methodically connecting each bottle's vintage to a specific tragedy in his family's business history. This 87 Barolo was acquired the same week my grandfather's pharmaceutical division released those contaminated pain medications. He continued during one particularly unsettling conversation. 347 people died before the recall. We knew about the contamination 6 months earlier. His sister Elena was equally withdrawn. But her isolation took a different form. She had converted the estate's tower rooms into what she called her listening post, a circular room filled with antique recording equipment and notebooks filled with meticulous handwritten transcripts. When I asked about her project, she simply said she was documenting the conversations the house remembers. Neither sibling seemed surprised when I mentioned the matching footsteps. They exchanged a look that suggested they had been waiting for this moment. The 14th night changed the rules entirely. Instead of simply matching my footsteps, the echo began to precede them. I would pause at the top of the main staircase, preparing to descend, and hear my exact footfall pattern begin 3 seconds before I actually started walking. The same rhythm, the same weight distribution, the same pace I would use but happening before I had decided to move. This development disturbed me more than the previous matching echoes. Being followed, even by an impossible presence, at least followed logical causation. But hearing my future movements suggested something far more complex than a simple haunting. This implied the house was somehow accessing my intentions before I had fully formed them myself. I began varying my routes randomly, making decisions about direction only at the last possible moment. The predecessor echoes adapted instantly, always maintaining their 3-second lead. When I chose to turn left toward the conservatory, the footsteps had already begun navigating that path. When I decided to check the library's security locks, the echo was already climbing those stairs. Sleep became elusive. During daylight hours, I found myself analysing every decision, wondering if my thoughts were somehow being monitored or anticipated. Was I still making autonomous choices, or was something else guiding my movements in a predetermined pattern? Victoria noticed my fatigue during our weekly progress meetings. "You seem unsettled, James," she observed over tea served in her private sitting room. "The estate can be overwhelming at first." The silence takes adjustment. When I mentioned the footsteps, her teacup remained perfectly steady against its saucer. She had been expecting this conversation. My grandfather heard them first, Victoria side setting down her teacup with the precision of practiced composure. He was 38 years old, managing the estate after Edmund's death. The footsteps began exactly 3 months after he took control of the family's business interests. She gestured toward a leather-bound journal on the side table. One I had not seen during my cataloguing of the estate's archives. He documented every incident for 7 years. The pattern was always the same. The house would begin responding to whoever carried the greatest responsibility for the family's activities. I opened the journal to a random entry dated September 15th, 1926. The footsteps preceded me again tonight. When I approached the study where the Midwest Railroad contracts are stored, it knew I intended to destroy the safety inspection reports. How does it know my intentions before I acknowledge them myself? Victoria watched me read, her pale blue eyes betraying no emotion. Each generation's executor experiences the phenomenon. My father endured it for 43 years. It began for me when he passed away in 2019, but you mentioned it stopped for you, I said, remembering her careful phrasing during my job interview about the house not responding after midnight. It stopped when I hired you, she replied. The responsibility transferred. The estate recognises you as the one who maintains its secrets now. You have access to all the records, all the files, all the evidence of what this family has done to accumulate our wealth. The teacup trembled slightly in my hands as understanding crystallised. I was not simply the estate manager. I had become the keeper of their accumulated guilt. That revelation should have prompted my immediate resignation. Any rational person would have gathered their belongings and departed before the next midnight patrol. But something held me to the estate beyond mere professional obligation or financial compensation. The footsteps had become part of my routine, almost companionable in their consistency. Moreover, I found myself drawn to the hidden records, spending daylight hours discovering the full scope of the Carmichael legacy. Each document revealed another layer of systematic harm, mining operations that knowingly exposed workers to toxic chemicals, construction projects that used substandard materials in low-income housing developments, pharmaceutical trials that falsified safety data to expedite drug approvals. The estate's library contained entire filing cabinets of suppressed testimonies, families destroyed by industrial accidents, communities poisoned by manufacturing waste, patients who had died from medications the Carmichaels knew were dangerous. Their stories had been silenced through legal settlements that included non-disclosure agreements. But the documents remained, stored like trophies in climate-controlled archives. Elena found me reading through these files on the 20th night. They speak to you now, don't they? She said, settling into the leather chair across from the reading desk. The voices of everyone our family harmed. I looked up from a particularly disturbing report about a factory explosion that had killed 27 workers in 1964. Is that what the footsteps are? The people your family silenced? Not exactly, Elena replied. The footsteps are the house's way of processing guilt. It's learned to carry the weight of our family's sins. But lately, it's been trying to communicate something more specific. She handed me a notebook filled with her careful transcriptions. I've been listening, and I think it's trying to tell us where the bodies are buried. Eleanor's notebooks contained 7 years of meticulous documentation. She had been recording the estate's sounds since her father's death, using equipment that could detect frequencies far below normal human hearing range. The transcripts revealed patterns that my nightly walks had only begun to uncover. The footsteps always lead to specific locations, she explained, flipping through pages of detailed floor plans marked with timestamps and route tracings. They're not random walks through the corridors. They're guided tours to places where evidence is stored. Her father had hidden the most incriminating documents throughout the estate. She told me, not in conventional safes or filing systems, but within the architecture itself, behind false walls, under floorboards. inside the hollow spaces between structural beams. Elena had been using the footsteps as a map, following their routes to discover these hidden caches. The house wants the truth to be found, she continued. It's tired of carrying our family's secrets. Every night it tries to guide someone to the evidence, hoping they'll bring it into the light. I studied her route tracings, recognizing several paths from my own nightly encounters with the matching footsteps. What kind of evidence? Photographs of the mining accidents my great-grandfather covered up. Audio recordings of safety meetings where executives decided to ignore fatal design flaws. Video testimonies from patients who reported severe side effects before the medications were approved for public distribution. Elena closed the notebook and met my eyes with an intensity that reminded me of her grandfather's portraits in the main hall. The footsteps have been leading you to the dining room's east wall for 6 consecutive nights. I think there's something there the house wants you to find. The east wall of the formal dining room appeared identical to its 3 companions' mahogany panelling that rose 12 feet to meet an ornate crown moulding, broken only by oil paintings of previous Carmichael patriarchs. But Eleanor's suggestion made me examine it with fresh attention during my next security round. The footsteps began their usual 3-second precedence as I approached the dining room entrance. They led me directly to the wall's centre section, where a portrait of Edmund Carmichael hung in an gilded frame that must have weighed 200 pounds. The predecessor echoes stopped precisely in front of this painting, then repeated the same short sequence. 3 steps forward, pause, 3 steps back. I examined the portrait more carefully. Edmund stared out from the canvas with the confident expression of a man who believed his wealth justified any action. But something about the painting's placement seemed wrong. The frame hung slightly lower than its neighbouring portraits, and the wall behind it showed subtle discoloration that suggested recent adjustment. When I pressed against the frame's edges, it moved. Not like a hanging painting should move, but as if the entire section was hinged. Further investigation revealed a concealed mechanism, a pressure point disguised as decorative moulding that, when activated, allowed the painting to swing outward on hidden hinges. Behind Edmund's portrait was a cavity approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Inside this space, I discovered a steel document case that had been professionally sealed against moisture and temperature fluctuation. The case required a combination lock, but when I turned the dial randomly, it opened immediately, as if it had been waiting. The document case contained materials that redefined my understanding of the Carmichael family's business practices. These were not merely unethical decisions made in pursuit of profit, these were systematic campaigns of destruction that spanned for generations. The earliest documents detailed Edmund Carmichael's involvement in the displacement of 3 Native American communities during railroad expansion in the 1880s. But these were not the bureaucratic papers I expected to find. Instead, I discovered photographs of mass graves, detailed maps marking burial sites, and personal correspondence discussing the final solution to the indigenous problem. Victoria's grandfather had documented his own expansion of these methods. During World War I, his munitions factories had deliberately produced defective artillery shells, knowing they would explode prematurely and kill American soldiers. The profits from fulfilling military contracts, even with defective products, had been too substantial to resist. The pharmaceutical empire built by Victoria's father revealed perhaps the most systematic harm. Clinical trial data showed that they had identified severe neurological side effects in their pain medications during early testing phases. Rather than halting development, they had simply relocated trials to developing countries where regulatory oversight was minimal and patient. Deaths could be attributed to pre-existing conditions. Most disturbing were the recent documents bearing Victoria's signature. environmental studies showing that their chemical manufacturing subsidiaries were knowingly contaminating water supplies in rural communities. Internal memos discussing the cost-benefit analysis of allowing people to die rather than implementing expensive safety modifications. Each generation had not merely continued their predecessors' practices, they had refined them, making them more efficient and more deadly. The Carmichael fortune was built on a foundation of carefully planned mass murder. I spent the remainder of that night reading through every document in the hidden case. By dawn, I understood that my position as estate manager carried responsibilities far beyond maintaining property and managing staff. I was now the custodian of evidence that could bring down one of America's oldest and most respected business dynasties. The footsteps had not been random hauntings or supernatural manifestations. They had been deliberate guidance, leading me to discover what previous generations of estate managers had been prevented from finding. The house itself had become a repository for the family's guilt, and it was actively working to expose the truth. Victoria found me in the dining room at 7:30 that morning, still seated beside the open secret compartment with documents spread across the mahogany table. She showed no surprise at the discovery, merely poured herself coffee from the silver service and settled into her usual breakfast chair. "You found grandfather's archive," she observed calmly. "I wondered when the house would finally lead someone there. You knew about this, of course. Every family head has known about the documentation since Edmund first started the collection. He believed keeping detailed records of our activities would provide protection against future legal challenges. Proof that everything was conducted according to carefully planned business strategies rather than random criminal impulses." Victoria sipped her coffee and studied the photographs of mass graves scattered across the table. What Edmund failed to anticipate was that these same records would eventually become evidence of premeditated genocide. The house has been trying to expose them for decades. The first estate manager who heard the footsteps was hired in 1932. Victoria continued, her voice maintaining the same conversational tone she used to discuss garden maintenance schedules. "My grandfather thought the phenomenon would stop if he brought in someone from outside the family to manage the property. Instead, the house began educating its caretakers." She gestured toward the documents with the casual air of someone discussing weather patterns. 7 estate managers over 90 years, each one eventually discovered some portion of the evidence. Most fled immediately upon understanding the scope of our family's activities. 2 attempted to contact authorities. I looked up from a particularly graphic photograph, showing the aftermath of a deliberately sabotaged mining operation. What happened to them? Automobile accidents, sudden heart attacks, the kind of unfortunate incidents that befall people who threaten powerful families. Victoria's pale blue eyes met mine across the table, but the house remembers them. Their presence added to the weight of guilt that the estate carries. Each death strengthened its desire to expose the truth. The implication crystallized with horrifying clarity. The previous estate managers had not simply discovered the Carmichael family's secrets, they had become additional victims, their murders adding to the accumulating evidence of systematic violence. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Victoria set down her coffee cup with characteristic precision. "Because you're different from the others. You haven't attempted to flee or contact authorities. You've been reading through the evidence methodically, documenting it, organizing it. The house trusts you." She paused, studying my face for reaction. "And frankly, so do I." Victoria's trust felt more like a trap than a compliment. But as I continued studying the hidden documents, a different understanding began to emerge. The Carmichael family was not a unified conspiracy spanning for generations. Each patriarch had operated in isolation, hiding their activities even from their own children until the moment of inheritance transfer. My father never told me about the pharmaceutical trials until the day before he died, Victoria admitted. I spent 58 years believing our wealth came from legitimate business innovations. Learning the truth was ... Devastating. She showed me her father's deathbed letter, written in trembling handwriting that deteriorated as his strength failed. The document revealed that each generation had inherited not just wealth, but responsibility for concealing evidence of their predecessors' crimes. The estate manager position had been created specifically to maintain this burden of secrecy. The house began responding to me immediately after father's death, Victoria continued. 3 years of footsteps, guiding me to different hidden archives, showing me the full scope of what our family had done. I couldn't bear the isolation of carrying those secrets alone. Marcus and Elena had also learned the truth upon reaching adulthood. Marcus's obsession with wine vintages was his method of processing the dates when specific atrocities had occurred. Eleanor's listening post had been her attempt to understand whether the estate itself was somehow conscious, actively working to expose the accumulated evidence. "We're not evil people, James," Victoria said quietly. "We're victims of inherited guilt, trapped by wealth that we can't legitimately claim but can't effectively renounce without destroying countless innocent people who depend on Carmichael businesses for their livelihoods." The contradiction Victoria described was more complex than simple moral cowardice. The Carmichael business empire now employed over 200,000 people worldwide. Their pharmaceutical subsidiaries produced medications that saved lives, even though their development had involved unconscionable human cost. Their construction companies built affordable housing, despite their history of using substandard materials that had killed previous residents. Dismantling the empire would eliminate jobs and services that millions of people depended upon. But continuing its operation perpetuated systems built on mass murder and systematic harm. The family had become trapped in a legacy that made ethical action impossible without causing additional suffering. "The estate has been trying to find a solution," Victoria explained, leading me through corridors that now felt different. Less like passages through a house and more like arteries through a thinking organism. The footsteps, the guided discoveries, the careful revelation of evidence it's all been working toward something specific. We climbed to Eleanor's tower sanctuary, where she had spent 7 years documenting the house's communications. The circular room was lined with recording equipment that captured sounds across multiple frequency ranges, while notebooks filled with transcribed conversations covered every available surface. "Show him the recent recordings," Victoria instructed her daughter. Elena activated a playback device that filled the room with sounds barely perceptible to human hearing, frequencies that registered more as vibrations than audible noise. But within these ghostly transmissions, I could distinguish something that resembled voices. Multiple voices, speaking in overlapping whispers that created a complex harmony of communication. "Those are the people our family killed," Elena said simply. "And they're trying to tell us how to make things right." The voices spoke in languages I couldn't identify, but Elena had been translating their messages for 3 years. Her notebooks contained hundreds of partial transcripts, each one representing fragments of conversations that occurred during the estate's quiet hours when electromagnetic interference was minimal. "They don't want revenge," Elena explained, turning to a section of transcripts dated from the previous month. "They want acknowledgement. They want their deaths to serve a purpose that prevents similar tragedies." The translated messages were remarkably consistent. The voices described specific locations where evidence of additional Carmichael crimes could be found, not just within the estate, but in corporate offices, private residences, and industrial facilities across the country. They provided detailed instructions for safely exposing these secrets without destroying the legitimate aspects of the business empire. Most significantly, they had developed a comprehensive plan for transitioning Carmichael Holdings into a charitable foundation that would specifically benefit communities the family had harmed. Workers in affected industries would receive retraining and relocation assistance. Families of victims would receive compensation that, while inadequate to restore lives, could provide opportunities for healing. The Voices understand economics, Victoria noted with something approaching admiration. They're not demanding destruction of everything the family built. They want transformation using our accumulated wealth to reverse the damage we've caused. Marcus had been implementing aspects of this plan for 2 years. His wine cellar had become a coordination centre where he managed discrete charitable activities that channeled family wealth toward victim compensation and community restoration. The vineyards he had purchased were actually employment programs for families, displaced by historical Carmichael business practices. The transformation process had already begun operating beneath the surface of normal family activities. Eleanor's listening post was not merely recording supernatural communications. She was coordinating with investigative journalists and legal advocates who specialised in historical corporate crimes. The evidence she provided allowed them to build cases that would hold up in court without directly implicating current family members. "We can't resurrect the dead," Victoria said, settling into a chair surrounded by Eleanor's recording equipment. "But we can ensure their deaths ultimately serve justice rather than simply generating profit." The plan required careful timing and sophisticated legal manoeuvring. To rapid an exposure of evidence would trigger defensive reactions from other corporations that had engaged in similar practices. To slow a process would allow additional harm while the transformation was implemented. The Voices had spent years developing strategies that would maximise positive impact while minimising collateral damage. My role as estate manager had evolved into something unprecedented. Instead of maintaining family secrets, I was now coordinating their systematic revelation. Instead of protecting Carmichael interests, I was facilitating their conversion into mechanisms for restitution and prevention. The footsteps that had once seemed like haunting manifestations were actually guidance from victims who had achieved something beyond simple posthumous existence. They had organised into a collective consciousness focused on preventing future atrocities while healing wounds from past ones. "The house has been preparing for this transformation for decades," Victoria explained. Every estate manager who discovered evidence, every family member who learned the truth, every victim whose death added to its accumulated guilt, all of that was building toward this moment when everything changes. The next phase required my participation in activities that technically constituted industrial espionage and corporate sabotage. But the targets were subsidiaries of the Carmichael empire that continued practices identical to those that had generated the family's historical guilt. Eleanor's supernatural contacts provided remarkably specific intelligence about ongoing criminal activities. A chemical plant in Louisiana that was deliberately contaminating groundwater. A pharmaceutical facility in Puerto Rico that was falsifying clinical trial data. A construction company in the Midwest that was using substandard materials in low-income housing developments. The Voices can perceive activities across vast distances, Elena explained during one of our coordination meetings. Death from corporate malfeasance creates a kind of spiritual resonance that allows victims to communicate with each other regardless of physical location. They form networks of shared information that are more comprehensive than any intelligence agency. Marcus had been using these networks to identify specific individuals within Carmichael companies who were responsible for ongoing harm, rather than exposing them through traditional legal channels, which would allow corporations to simply transfer blame to expendable employees. The plan involved gathering evidence that revealed systematic corporate policies rather than individual malfeasance. Victoria's role had become coordination with federal agencies that specialised in corporate crime investigation. Her reputation as a respected businesswoman provided access to regulatory officials who would otherwise dismiss accusations against established companies. She was carefully building relationships that would ensure evidence was properly investigated rather than suppressed. "We're not trying to destroy capitalism," Victoria clarified during one particularly intense planning session. "We're trying to demonstrate that sustainable profit is possible without systematic harm to workers, consumers, and communities. The transformation accelerated rapidly once all family members were coordinating with the supernatural intelligence network. Evidence that had been hidden for decades began surfacing in carefully orchestrated revelations that built public awareness without triggering corporate defensive strategies. Environmental contamination sites were exposed through anonymous tips to investigative journalists. Pharmaceutical safety data appeared in regulatory agency files through channels that couldn't be traced back to Carmichael sources. Construction safety violations were reported by anonymous whistleblowers, whose identities were protected by supernatural intervention that prevented corporate retaliation. Each revelation was strategically timed to support legal cases that had been building for months. Environmental cleanup efforts were funded by charitable foundations that Marcus had established using family wealth. Victim compensation programs were implemented through legal settlements that Victoria negotiated with regulatory agencies. The footsteps that had once preceded my movements through the estate's corridors began occurring during daylight hours as well. But instead of matching my pace, they were now leading me to specific locations where additional coordination activities were needed. The house had become a command centre for the most complex corporate accountability campaign in American history. "The voices are pleased with our progress," Elena reported during our weekly strategy meetings. "They're providing information about similar criminal enterprises operated by other wealthy families. This could become a model for transforming inherited guilt into institutional justice." The estate itself seemed to be changing. Corridors that had felt oppressive now seemed purposeful. Rooms that had harboured decades of hidden evidence now served as coordination centres for victim advocacy and corporate accountability. 6 months after discovering Edmund's hidden archive, the first major public revelation occurred. The Environmental Protection Agency announced massive fines against 3 Carmichael chemical subsidiaries, supported by evidence that documented 60 years of deliberate environmental contamination. The evidence had been provided by anonymous sources whose identities were protected through legal mechanisms that Victoria had spent months developing with federal prosecutors. The announcement triggered a cascade of additional investigations. Pharmaceutical regulatory agencies opened reviews of medication approval processes dating back to the 1960s. Construction safety boards began examining building practices in low-income communities where Carmichael companies had operated. But instead of destroying the business empire, these investigations were facilitating its transformation. Each revealed criminal practice was immediately replaced by restitution programs that exceeded legal requirements. Environmental cleanup efforts went beyond regulatory mandates to implement prevention systems that would serve as industry models. "The voices want change, not revenge," Victoria explained to reporters, who gathered at the estate for a press conference announcing the family's cooperation with multiple federal investigations. "They're helping us understand how inherited wealth can serve justice rather than perpetuate harm." The statement was carefully crafted to acknowledge supernatural assistance without triggering skepticism that would undermine the transformation project. Victoria presented the revelations as the result of newly discovered family archives rather than guidance from posthumous victims. Eleanor's recordings had provided specific language that would resonate with public audiences while maintaining credibility with legal and regulatory officials. The voices understood media dynamics as clearly as they understood corporate strategy. The estate's atmosphere continued evolving as the transformation project progressed. Footsteps that had once seemed ominous now felt celebratory. The house itself appeared to be experiencing relief as decades of accumulated guilt were converted into mechanisms for justice and healing. Eleanor's listening post had become unnecessary as communication with the supernatural network became more direct. During quiet evening hours, conversations could be heard throughout the estate without special recording equipment. The voices spoke in multiple languages, sharing information about corporate crimes worldwide and coordinating advocacy strategies that transcended national boundaries. Marcus discovered that his wine collection had developed unusual properties. Bottles from years when specific atrocities occurred now contained what could only be described as memory. When opened, these wines produced sensory experiences that allowed drinkers to understand the historical events with unprecedented clarity and emotional impact. "It's not hallucination," Marcus explained after sharing a 1947 vintage. That contained memories of the steel foundry collapse. "It's more like direct knowledge transfer. The wine carries actual experiences from victims who died during these incidents." These memory wines became powerful tools for educating corporate executives, regulatory officials, and legal advocates about the human cost of historical business practices. Rather than reading statistical reports about industrial accidents, participants could experience the terror and pain that workers had endured, creating motivation for implementing prevention systems that would prevent similar tragedies. Victoria began organising tasting events that brought together business leaders, government officials, and victim advocacy groups. The shared experiences created unprecedented cooperation between groups that had historically operated as adversaries. 2 years after my first encounter with the matching footsteps, the Carmichael estate had become the headquarters for an international network of corporate accountability advocates. The supernatural intelligence that Elena had been documenting was now coordinating similar transformation projects worldwide. Connecting with victims of corporate crimes across multiple continents, the business empire had been completely restructured. Manufacturing facilities had been converted to worker cooperatives. Pharmaceutical operations focused exclusively on medications for diseases that affected impoverished communities. Construction companies specialised in affordable housing that exceeded safety standards rather than cutting costs through dangerous shortcuts. Most remarkably, these ethical business practices had proved more profitable than their criminal predecessors. Workers who owned equity in their companies were more productive. Medications that actually helped patients generated sustainable demand. Safe, affordable housing created loyal customers and positive community relationships. "Guilt is expensive," Victoria observed during our final coordination meeting. Concealing criminal activities, suppressing evidence, eliminating witnesses, all of that required enormous resources that are now available for productive activities. The estate itself had become a teaching centre where business leaders could learn sustainable practices while understanding the human cost of exploitative alternatives. Eleanor's recording equipment was now used to document success stories rather than supernatural communications. Marcus's wine collection served as a historical archive that preserved memories of both tragedies and their eventual transformation into justice. The footsteps had stopped entirely. Whatever consciousness had inhabited the estate for decades had apparently achieved its goal. The house felt peaceful now, its corridors filled with purposeful activity rather than accumulated guilt. The silence that had once concealed terrible secrets now reflected satisfaction at meaningful accomplishment. I remain at the Carmichael estate, though my role has evolved far beyond traditional property management. The family has asked me to document this entire experience for other wealthy families who might be carrying similar burdens of inherited guilt. The supernatural network that guided our transformation has provided information about hundreds of other business dynasties that could benefit from similar accountability processes. The voices still speak occasionally, though their communications now focus on prevention rather than revelation. They share intelligence about emerging corporate crimes, allowing intervention before harm occurs rather than justice after victims accumulate. The estate has become a monitoring station for global corporate accountability, connected to a network of posthumous advocates who maintain surveillance of business practices worldwide. Victoria has established a foundation that provides resources for other families who want to transform inherited wealth from criminal enterprises into legitimate charitable activities. Elena coordinates with investigative journalists who specialize in historical corporate crimes. Marcus manages victim compensation programs that address systematic harm dating back generations. They said the estate never answered, but now I understand that it had been answering all along, not with words, but with actions that gradually revealed truth while building mechanisms for justice. The footsteps that matched my nightly rounds were not supernatural harassment, but patient guidance from victims who had organized beyond death to ensure their suffering served prevention rather than simply generating profit. The silence that wealthy families cultivate to protect their secrets can also amplify voices demanding accountability. Sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. Sometimes inherited guilt becomes inherited responsibility. Sometimes houses remember more than their inhabitants want to admit.